Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. Gentlemen, thank you. I went to the floor the 1st of May and in a very loud voice said, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is America's gas consumer speaking." From that day until today, in Idaho, gas has gone up a cent a day. A not unusual scenario across the country. And so maybe I need to go yell out again if this is going to continue, but I hear some sense of maybe moderation into the summer. I also find it very, very fascinating, Mr. Sankey, you talk about where the industry saw itself going and therefore projecting investment into the future of refinery capacity until we began to get busy talking about alternatives. And now I understand maybe there's a little back off in relation to that investment. So let me ask this question of any of you who would like to respond to it. If, in fact, we meet our challenges that we've challenged ourselves to of 30 billion gallons of biofuels over the extended period of time we're talking about, some cellulosic, some corn, we get at a 4% annualized CAFE increase mandated by law. Do we need any refinery capacity?
No.
I agree. None.
Will we stimulate investment in refinery capacity if we continue to proceed in this manner?
No.
I think the only thing you'll see is creep to meet short-term market needs and meet any kind of regulatory requirements on the refining system.
You know, you can look at if you can lower demand here, you can look at it as adding capacity for free on the supply side. And this is what the oil companies are terrified of, is that if you can somehow get people to drive more efficient cars, if you can get ethanol working in a market competitive manner, then what you'll be doing is adding refining capacity for $0.
I think one thing to add is that you talked about the 22 million barrels a day of demand and 17 million barrels a day of refining capacity. The U.S. refining system is actually quite low cost compared to the rest of the world. So if we start adding biofuels, you may not need to add refining capacity, but the first thing that would probably happen is you'll back down imports of imported gasoline or blending components.
If we were to add into that, which we have not yet, the concept of coal to liquids, it's not in that scenario I just gave you. That almost assures no additional capacity, or at least on the margin a little, I assume, until we would anticipate these kinds of approaches coming online. Reaction?
Well, if coal to liquids definitely helps if you don't care about CO2. I mean, you have to recognize that we have here a refinery that will turn a barrel of oil into a barrel of a range of products, but about 5% of the energy content lost. The equivalent for coal to liquids would be about 50% of the energy. And you have a massive CO2 impact. If CO2 is not a concern, then coal to liquids is a great way forward. And I've often mandated, in fact, I've suggested in previous testimony that the government should build the strategic petroleum reserve from coal to liquids. And that, in that way, stop the government from competing in the market, because that's what you're doing by buying crude to fill the SPR. That's how I see, that's one of the key things I believe your government should be doing. And the second would be, as an aside, what you're doing effectively with coal to liquids, which is research and development. What we haven't mentioned is that the poor returns in refining and in oil for the past 20 years means that we really haven't looked at research and development very hard here at all, which is why cellulosic ethanol is so interesting. Where you've been worrying about research and development has been in the drug companies and trying to find a cure for cancer and AIDS. No one's really looked that hard at energy relative to the potential for us to do more here, and I would thoroughly encourage you to do that.
My last thought in relation to a greater degree of independence on the part of this country in supply is proven reserves and the development of those reserves in the Outer Continental Shelf, and we've made some moves in that direction. If, Guy, in your comments talking about OPEC and their response to need and their decision to keep their hands on the valve and to keep it relatively closed at a time when we would need it. A combination of things, gentlemen. Do we affect world price of crude in light of the demand if we do what I said earlier, recognizing we're still going to need a continual stream of hydrocarbons out into the near future or out into the distant future, that we will need to continue to develop our reserves and to assure the knowledge of those reserves to the industry here, and at the same time increase capacity in these areas of the biofuels? Would that affect our price at home?
I think it definitely would affect the price. And not only that, but going back to Senator Dorgan's comment about, indeed, there is not a truly free market because obviously OPEC is withholding supply. It would also make it more difficult for either OPEC or individual members to have greater control in the market. The reason OPEC has been successful, if you will, over the last several years, is the lack of spare productive capacity. When there's no alternative, which there is not right now, Saudi Arabia has almost all the spare productive capacity in the world as we sit here. So doing what you've just said, a combination of things, that increased supply and reduced demand, would certainly, all other things being equal, lead to more spare productive capacity, making it more difficult for any group of countries to manage the market as they're doing now.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chairman, I make that scenario with this knowledge that the northern Saudi oil fields adjacent to the Iraqi border stay productive. If they were to have in any way a downside as a result of current politics and strife in the region, then you set up a whole new scenario for a time, especially if those fields came offline. And that, I think, is a concern we all have at this moment as we look at the broader picture. And I guess, Mr. Sankey, you would not at that time be able to predict what the future would look like.
Well, refining is notoriously difficult to predict. You've got to think last year was a record year, and the companies made losses in 2 of the months of the year last year. What I would say to you on OPEC is that the Saudis are the least of your problems. The 5 biggest members of OPEC are Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, and Venezuela. Saudis, the least.
Don't remind me of that. Thank you.
One thing that we always interest our salespeople by saying is that 72% of the world's remaining oil reserves are now Muslim, and of the remaining 28%, 20 are in Venezuela and Russia.
Yeah, don't remind me of that either. Thank you.